Just like an investor has a portfolio and
Yeah.
you're going to have different criteria you're looking for depending on certain asset classes, impact investment is a lens. So the way we think about it is you can look at anything through that lens of impact investments. But the piece I always challenge people with is if you're ignoring what you invest in, let's say that with that 5% you're granting to environmental projects,
Mm.
but with the millions of dollars sitting on the stock market, you're investing in companies that are creating that environmental degradation. You're having more negative impact than positive. The piece that I love business leaders to think about is even if for you, the driver of your business never seemed like it was this big social or environmental issue. You said, we just make these amazing, let's say, water bottles, like my water bottle here. We make this amazing product that we're really passionate about,
Yeah.
and we do that really well. So even if it feels not at that level of social or environmental, what's interesting is most people, when they feel that pull that you described of like, I would love to do this, but it's too expensive or too time consuming, I'll get to it one day, like when we're bigger, when we're more profitable.
Hello, team. Welcome again to another great week. I'm going to throw a challenge at you from the very get-go here today, and it's tied into our discussion, of course, but I'm wondering how many of you would know the meaning behind some of the following abbreviations. We'll start with an easy one, I think. I'm guessing most of you are going to be familiar with, but if I said the initials ESG, what immediately springs to mind? So that was a warm-up. What about SRI, CSR, and perhaps even GIIN, which I had never heard of until I was doing some preparation for today's conversation. So how are you going so far? What about if I asked you to define the activity of impact investing? Or perhaps even go a little bit deeper than that and discuss the strategies that sit behind this concept. Well, I'm guessing some of you by now have already realized that today we're going to be speaking about what I feel is a truly powerful catalyst, which is starting to drive a shift in focus for many businesses. And that's the union between the financial return that we're all after and a fostering of a more positive social and environmental impact through what we do. So, listeners, hopefully you're on board. Today, we're going to try and discover how this approach can not only benefit investors and you as companies, but also contribute to a more sustainable, even equitable future. So, of course, this is not my forte. So, here to help us with this conversation, and I have to say, and share her considerable insights, is our industry leader in this field, Bessi Graham. Bessi, welcome to the ET Project. Wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. You've dropped lots of little pebbles there that we'll have to pick up on.
Well, we'll see how many we unpack, but I
Mm.
mean, this is a fascinating topic around this whole impact investing, and I know you've been involved in it so heavily for a long time, and I'm excited to learn more about it myself. So, as we always do, if you don't mind, before we dive into that topic, if you can just share a little bit about your own backstory and perhaps what led you to this whole concept of doing good while doing well, if that's the right
Yeah,
terminology.
absolutely. Yeah, I think there's lots of ways you could describe it. I often say that it's about merging money and meaning.
Hmm.
You could talk about it as you did in that element of doing good while doing well. Really, at the heart of all of my work, and this does take us right back to the beginning of how I began to come into this space, it is about saying, two things that seem like contradictions can be equally true.
Mm.
And when we sit with and just be honest about ourselves as individuals and go, I'm more than one thing. Like, you can't just put me in a neat little box and that describes me in my entirety. That exploration, that desire to have a broader sense of my own person, if you like, me as a leader, me as a business owner, being able to show up more fully in my work was really what I was always looking for.
Mm.
So if we go right back to when I was still at school, I was someone who was raised in a family where there was a strong sense of social justice
Okay.
and wanting to contribute, that old saying, to whom much is given, much is expected. So I was always interested in and actively involved in wanting to make a positive difference in the world.
Mm.
But what I realized very early on was that I didn't fit neatly or naturally into that charitable space or the non-profit sector,
Right.
and felt kind of boxed in by it because I was like, oh, but there's different ways we could do things. And there's elements I love about business. And what if we thought about it in this new way? So I was
Mm.
wanting to push those boundaries. So that was one element of me. I was really involved in and studied in my undergraduate and postgraduate, studied politics, international relations. My master's was in counterterrorism. So I was interested in both the leadership angle of how do we get people to think and act in certain ways? How does a movement come about? So I saw that role of both leadership and government as really important too if we wanted to make a change in the world. And as I mentioned, there was this underlying interest in business and being innovative and
Mm.
solving problems. So really, if I look at the different businesses I've built and certainly the common thread across all of my work from a career perspective, it's been sitting in that space of where can I work on projects or work with companies or design different interventions that tap into the best of the nonprofit social sector, that tap into the best of government's role and the best of business. And that has been really where it's led. So the clients and the people that I work with tend to be in that space of business leaders, so privately owned small and medium-sized businesses who really have the opportunity, once they tune their mind to it, to make a difference, to make different decisions in their business that mean that they can strengthen the financial stability of the business, but do it in a way that's actually having a more positive impact in the world.
Right.
And that brings us kind of full circle to that desire to how do we merge money and meaning,
Mm.
which for me is more important than any particular label you use. So if someone felt put off by the word impact investment or thinks, well, I'm running a business, you're still totally going to get things out of this conversation because it's a pragmatic conversation that is in no way kind of saying making money is bad, you should give it all away.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about here. It's really strengthening both. It's a self-reinforcing loop, if you like.
I think your co-founder of the company Benefit Capital, Paul is it?
Yep. Yes.
Uses the expression or collectively use the expression blended value, and I love that, and we'll definitely touch on that as we go deeper. You mentioned a word there before that took me a little bit out of left field. Counterterrorism. You mastered in counterterrorism. Please elaborate
Yeah.
more on this and what happened to that journey.
Well, I still see it. It's interesting because a lot of people say, tell me the connection there. Like, how do we make the leap from there to where you are now? When I mentioned those elements of leadership, how does a movement come about? How
Mm.
do you inspire and engage people to think and act differently?
Right.
There's always two sides to every coin. There's a reason why people are drawn to extremes and to really charismatic people who may end up having very negative impacts in the world.
Yeah.
There's still things we can learn in terms of the psychology and the style of how that comes about.
Mhm.
And for me, in wanting to make sure I had as broad an understanding as possible, really seeing what makes people tick, how they are making those decisions was critically important. And I would say that much of the work that I now do and how I work with companies
Mhm.
is still informed by, the thesis I wrote in my master's, by understanding different leadership styles, understanding what goes wrong when we really misread
Right.
the audience of who we're trying to influence, and we end up kind of not being able to get traction. As business owners and business leaders, that's critical. If we are talking up here and either our team or our customers just don't quite get it, we're not going to get that cut through. And so all of the elements around leadership, followership, charisma, psychology, all of those pieces that are key elements of understanding something like terrorism, and then the counterterrorism piece of trying to shift that to a positive space, are very transferable into both the leadership elements and definitely the business elements of running a solid business over time.
How much would you build into that leadership discussion then? Narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, like the dark triad, if you like, that they talk about in psychology. Is that also part of that factoring when you think about the counterterrorism or the terrorism and bring that to leadership?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not actively going out trying to find and convert the worst possible business leaders and convince them to change. I'm very selective of who we work with and who we're trying to strengthen and build their businesses. So I wouldn't say all my energy is going into those elements you've just described. What
Mm,
I would say is that we all have shadow elements. All of us have intended and unintended elements of how our leadership styles and our behaviors are having impact in the world. And where it comes down to the conversations that I have with individual leaders, a lot of it actually goes even further back into many of the different ancient thinking traditions, whether it's ancient Greek philosophy or it's the Eastern traditions,
yeah.
of there's this common element that I think more leaders need to sit with, which is around really where we all start. And the most important foundational question is around know thyself, was the old
Mm,
ancient Greek way of saying it. But that level of self awareness as a leader, being honest and tuned in
mm,
to your own shadow sides, to those spaces where you might get pushed into behaving in a way that is neither helpful for the company or aligned with your identity of who you want to be and how you want to show up in the world.
mm.
Those are all conversations that we need to create space for leaders to have, because I'm sure that you found this, and probably is part of why you have this podcast. As leaders, very rarely are we regularly surrounded by or supported in a genuine way of having people who will call us out, people who will say things that we may not want to hear, or that will be a sounding board for us. And so I take really seriously that privilege that when there's trust and rapport there with a leader, part of my job is to put a spotlight, if you like, on things that might be uncomfortable,
Mhm.
but that need to be addressed if that leader wants to actually break through to the next stage in their business.
So such an important factor, and absolutely agree with you that the majority of clients we work with don't have that environment.
No.
Accountability partners is a
Yep.
nice catchphrase, but the
Yeah.
majority of leaders simply don't have that surrounding. So yeah. Hey, I'm
Yeah.
curious, Bessie, who were your mentors at an early age? I'm guessing parents, but were there
Mhm.
any other specific um, friends, family members, influences?
I'm very fortunate. I always say that I remember years ago reading Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers,
Mm,
and he talked about the fact that you only have to be smart enough. Like there's a lot of focus on like how do you be the smartest person. I've never been and have no desire to be the smartest person in the room. In fact, I try to always be in a room where I'm at the bottom of the rung because I'm driven and I'm curious and ambitious. So, like, the
yeah,
smarter people that are there, the more I'm going to be lifted up. I have no desire to be the top dog, if you like.
yeah.
But when I read that book, I found that really encouraging. And the other piece that stood out to me that was kind of an aha moment was that he talked about the fact that you don't have to necessarily see what you inherited or the privilege of your upbringing about were you given financial things. So my
Mm.
parents weren't in a position to financially set us up or give
Right.
us money, but what my parents did have was amazing friends. And so I was always the kid who was drawn to and in conversations with my parents' friends, not the kids my age. So I have a lot of mentors and people who have influenced my thinking
Mm.
around things like, I touched on some of that ancient Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
I have a bunch of my dad's friends who heavily influenced my thinking in that space. I had an early mentor who I then went on to work with, who then for over 10 years was a board member of one of my companies that I set up. And he was and still is an owner in the first ethical investment company here in Australia. And so he shaped a lot of my thinking around going, you don't have to compromise on losing financial reward and return just because you're making an investment that
Mm.
is connected to your values. So he was a big mentor and is still heavily involved in my life. So there's many, many people who would fit into that category. And I'm very conscious of making sure that I'm always providing that opportunity when others, need someone to ask questions of and they're on their own journey. I've had so many people be incredibly generous with their time and wisdom with me. I think all leaders need to be really hungry for and open to others pouring into them and then passing that on to those that need that support from you.
Yeah, it is so important. We with our programs that we run, we talk about this a lot, surrounding yourself with, we call it a personal board of investors or personal board,
Exactly.
um,
Yeah. Advisors, whatever you want to call them. Yeah.
advisors, mentors, coaches, whatever you want to
So
have,
important.
but so important. Hey, you've mentioned a couple of times Western philosophy in particular. I'm wondering,
Yeah.
are there any of the Stoics who are your favorites? Like, do you like reading about any particular person and their writings?
So I did, at university, I did study some of that. One of the mentors that I had, again, one of those strange, beautiful, generous moments where I'm not even sure why he gave me the time of day. But
Right.
there's a philosopher in the US, Tom Morris,
Mhm.
who wrote If Aristotle Ran General Motors. It was a huge hit back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And when he was at the height of that, uh, one of my parents' friends here had been emailing with him back in the early days where we didn't have mobile phones, etc. And I was traveling. So I think I was 19 at the time. And I had the privilege of spending a few days with him. And he gave me all of his books and talked to me about different elements and still is connected. I had him on my podcast not that long ago. And there's so many elements of those thinkers, whether it's Socrates, Aristotle, I mean, they were all in the same vein, trained by each other. But many of their thoughts around something like rhetoric, which we now use that word almost in a negative way of like, oh, that's just rhetoric, like empty rhetoric.
Yeah.
But we've lost the richness of the history of where that came from and the different types of language and speech.
Mm.
So for me, the thinkers that are in that category where they're talking about the centrality of deeply understanding and respecting your audience and knowing how to communicate to them in the right way to get a certain outcome, they've been the most influential in the designing of my work with businesses and that aspect of how do we position our business? How do we actually articulate and differentiate our business from others? A lot of that work is connected to the ancient Greek
Mm.
thinkers.
Mm.
And my partner, Brad, his PhD was actually on the aspects of rhetoric and design thinking and how that plays out. So he's far more of an expert than I am, but that has shaped our work. So Brad and I have been together for 21 years, and the ancient Greek elements are the fingerprints are all over our work.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Let's dive into impact investing. Otherwise, we'll
Yeah, of
spend
course.
the whole time
No,
talking
it's
about
fine.
more interesting
Leadership.
things.
Yeah.
But anyway, Uh, I'm guessing a number of listeners probably aren't so familiar with the term impact investing. Do you have a simple definition for how you introduce what this is?
Yeah, so I always think about it. I mentioned before that I worked with the first ethical investment advisors in Australia. Probably the first thing to say is that different people use different terms. Some people talk about responsible investment, some people talk about ethical investment, impact investment. So often they're all kind of smushed together and
Mm,
thought that they're the same thing. For me, having been involved and exposed more than 2 decades ago to ethical investment, when I moved in about 2010 into the impact investment space, I was very clear on the difference between the two. So here's how I would describe it. Ethical investment in those early days, which has now been around for like 40 years or so,
mm,
was about intention. So it was saying, I am actively thinking about and being conscious of where I put my money to work, whether that is about the bank I put my savings in and knowing where they're investing that capital, or if it is in the shares I buy on the stock market or the companies I back if I'm doing direct investment. So it had this intention. You were being thoughtful about where you put your money to work in the world. When we moved and impact investments started to become more popular in the kind of 2010 onwards
mm,
place, and over the last few years has become more of an interesting topic that people are talking about.
right,
But the transition in the way I would describe it is that it was moving from having good intentions to having intention and measurability. So
right,
it was about saying, I'm actively choosing where I put my money to work, but I don't just want to hear a hopeful good story that it's making a difference in the world. I want to be able to actually explain and see and manage that impact so I can say this is what it hoped to do and now I know that's what my work's doing. So
right.
that's kind of the distinction I would make is the impact investment is looking for the intention and measurability of the investments that you make with everything from savings in a bank, where you're spending your dollars with, what you're buying, etc., through to something like a direct investment in a company.
Mm. So that's definitely the impact side, and then the investing. What I find interesting is a lot of philanthropy, if you like, is providing the capital to do something, but this is
Hmm.
investing and this is expecting that
Absolutely.
there is a return.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and I find that that's for me was something I was sort of overlooking a lot when I used or read about impact investing. So it's not just about, being that philanthropist. It's
No.
investing wisely, investing
Yes.
intentionally in a business that
Yes.
you believe in, but also you believe that they have the capacity to generate the
Yeah.
right return for you.
That's right. Because the critical word that otherwise you're ignoring is the investment word. So it's
Yes,
not saying make a grant, it's saying make an investment.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
you're absolutely correct that for many people, there's still a struggle with that.
Mm,
So, our work from a benefit capital perspective, constantly we're talking to people about there's these unconscious beliefs we have about the purpose of business. There's
mm,
a discomfort for many people when you start to bring into the same conversation these ideas of contribution or making a difference in the world and then talk about making money. They're like, oh, hang on a minute, that doesn't feel right.
right.
So, that piece that you've just spoken about is really important. And it's why I always say to people there are a lot of uh, writings and thinkers out there, if you look up impact investment, that talk about it as an asset class. I don't
Mm,
think that's helpful because it's not one type of investment. Just like an investor has a portfolio and
yeah.
you're going to have different criteria you're looking for depending on certain asset classes. Impact investment is a lens. So the way we think about it is you can look at anything through that lens of impact investment. So you can be saying, okay, with the percentage of my portfolio where I'm willing to be quite speculative, and if I lose it, that's okay. I
Right.
might make a really high risk investment in my impact investments. But then if I'm doing something that really needs to be secure or needs to be liquid, then I can still take an impact investment lens, but I'm looking for something that's lower risk, that might just be a debt piece with a set return. So thinking of it as that lens, not one asset
Mm,
class. You can
mm.
invest across asset classes as an impact investor is really important.
Right. So you can look at it as a spectrum almost. You can go
Yeah,
from one
like
end to
any
the
other
other.
investment.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And then the other distinction I'd make when you mentioned, say, philanthropy,
Yes.
we have always kind of tried to point out to people that even a philanthropic trust, so even if someone is talking about their philanthropy, you wear different hats. So philanthropic foundations or trusts have what we in Australia would call a corpus. Whatever you call that bucket of money that you invest, right?
Mhm.
Usually, as soon as someone talks about their philanthropy, all they're talking about is the granting, which is just a percentage of the money they make off those underlying investments.
Right.
And the granting dollars is a small part of the leverage that you have to play with as a philanthropist. Impact investment allows you for the first time as a philanthropist to be more conscious of what are we doing with all of that capital, and now not just see our contribution in the world being with that small percentage of, depending what country you're in, you have to give away 2%, maybe 5% of what you're making. Well, okay, that's nice. But the piece I always challenge people with is if you're ignoring what you invest in, let's say that with that 5% you're granting to environmental projects,
Mm.
but with the millions of dollars sitting on the stock market, you're investing in companies that are creating that environmental degradation. You're having more negative impact than positive. So let's be honest about that. You need to think about where you're investing those dollars. And that's why this conversation is really important, whether we're looking at it with our investment dollars, our
Mm.
philanthropic dollars, or as business leaders with the decisions we're making in house. Wherever that conversation goes, or for anyone listening, you need to be able to go, what are the decisions I have control over? And how do I look at the whole rather than just biting off this little bit and saying, I feel nice because I've made this donation or this grant here, but ignoring all of the levers that were at your disposal. I want people to be pulling on every element where they could be having a bigger impact in the world.
There's so many avenues we can go off that. That's one statement by itself. But what I was really surprised by in preparing for our conversation was I was reading some reports, and I think the Global Impact Investment
Impact
Network, the
investment network.
GIIN,
Yes.
has recently released its 2024 report, and if I'm correct, they were saying something like 1.5 trillion dollars, US dollars, I guess,
Yeah.
invested in impact through impact investing,
Yeah.
which is a record. But that's a considerable year-on-year compounding improvement over the last
Yeah.
5 years. So
And
this is
yeah.
something that is really gaining momentum, and I was totally taken back by that because I had read other reports, um, particularly with a number of companies in America, where the topic of ESG
Yeah.
was starting to lose its shine. And people, businesses in particular, were starting to push back and say, we've poured a lot of money into ESG, but we're not seeing any benefit and return. And now we're going to commit less of our next year's budget to moving in that direction. And
Yeah.
so I see that there's a little bit of a dichotomy there between the direction. I wonder what your take on that is.
So those companies that are making the calls and decisions around pulling back from ESG, there's two pieces I'd say related to that.
Mm.
For some companies where there's been almost a sense of being disappointed by or feeling like, well, that was a waste of time, effort, money.
Right.
For some of those, it is a decision that's being made because they actually went about it in a token way. So it was kind of superficial, tick the boxes, say, oh, okay, if we have 3 women on our board, that means we've ticked the box of we're doing governance properly. So they're doing things in a token way
Yeah.
and they're not seeing the results, or they're saying, we have to show diversity. So we're going to say that's one of our values. And this year we'll sponsor this event. And so they're doing pieces performatively that look like they're ticking a box of either environmental, social, or governance pieces for ESG, but they're wondering why they're not getting the win. So to me, it's because it's transactional. All of the work that I do with companies around saying, I'm actually not interested in a performative transactional approach that's ticking
Mm.
boxes. I'm interested in understanding the levers you can pull in your business where you have decision-making rights and actually fundamentally making sure what we're designing strengthens your business
Right.
and plays out in how you behave and operate so that we create a win-win. That embedding it into the operations of your business
Mm.
is a totally different approach. So for some, it hasn't given the results they hoped for because it didn't actually fundamentally change how they operated. It added in layers of complexity or cost or just surface level pieces,
Right.
but it was seen as an add-on, not the core strategy. So that was one group and why they're struggling.
Mm.
For a whole bunch of other groups that are very verbally pulling back from ESG, it's because they were never committed in the first place. And actually, what they're going back to is what they fundamentally believe. Like, so they were using it as a greenwashing piece.
Yep.
The moment they could get away with not having it, they've just gone back. So nothing's actually changed again in their fundamental underlying beliefs or values as a company. So that's how I would respond to the elements that are pulling back from ESG. And I think it's a misunderstanding of how you could use it as a competitive advantage in the first place in a genuine way.
Mm.
Related to the stats you quoted and the pieces around that most business leaders are quite surprised when they actually hear the level of investment dollars that are going into being
Yes.
more conscious now of some of these things, whether it's environmental, social governance or other impact investment things, where they're looking, for example, at a particular theme or problem in the world. So they might be actively looking for investments
Mm.
that are contributing to a certain issue, like a gender pay gap piece, or that they're contributing to ending homelessness. Like, so there may be a theme behind their investments. The piece that I love business leaders to think about is, even if for you, the driver of your business never seemed like it was this big social or environmental issue. You said, we just make these amazing, let's say, water bottles, like my water bottle here. We make this amazing product that we're really passionate about, and we do that really well. So even if it feels not at that level of social or environmental, the fact is that as you grow that business, either you might want to take on private investment, you'll certainly have insurance in the mix, you'll have all of these different elements that play into the
Mm.
financial market. And those external players are now asking different questions
Mm.
to what they asked before.
Yes.
Your insurance companies are pricing the risk of your business, now considering the fact that the access to raw materials is going to change based on drastic environmental elements of, floods or fires. All of these pieces are playing into your business in a way they never did before.
Mm.
And from an investment perspective, I want business owners to be thinking about, how do I have a sellable asset here? How do I, when I at some point don't want to be working at the level I am, how do I have something that if I wanted to, you don't have to, but if I wanted to, I could sell this business? Those kinds of conversations then lead us down that road of saying, well, what are investors looking for? And some of the research that I love talks about, say, the environmental, social, and governance pieces. If you actually have genuine, not those token bits we talked about before,
Mm.
but if you've embedded into the way you're making decisions, how you actually track elements in your business around the environmental impact of your supply chain or your power usage or whatever is relevant for you. If you're looking at those aspects of how your company is perceived in the community, when you look at how you treat your employees, the provisions that you have for them, your thoughts about their well-being and the safety of their work environment. And when you look at elements around governance and making sure there's not corruption and making sure there's some diversity there, When we then look at how that plays out for investors, people who have embedded these practices have quicker deal time, which is really important because if anyone's gone through being bought before, the due diligence and all of the work that goes into selling a company,
Mm,
that is drastically sped up when you have these pieces in place because it gives trust. It means you already have easily accessible data to back up systems and processes and what's in place. And it also is shown through the research to increase the sale price because there is value and a de-risked sense of how your business is set up for the long-term success, not just a short-term exploitative win.
mm,
So even if someone isn't driven by the social and environmental side, those questions are being asked of you by external investors, by banks who are going to invest in you, by your insurance, by your customers. All of those pieces now, there is incentive for you to start thinking about how you're going to approach that and do it in a way that's not a distraction or a cost to your business that isn't connected to actually strengthening the business long term. I want people to think about it in a way that means you don't have to justify it. You actually can say, wow, in doing this, we are strengthening that financial stability of the business. We're
mm.
de-risking it long term, and we're now spotting opportunities quicker.
Well, one of the challenges that I've experienced myself
Yeah.
working at an operational level versus sitting on a board is, and I know boards don't always exist when we're talking about smaller organizations, but when we get to the larger corporations,
Mm.
is that disconnect. So
Yeah.
on the one hand, we have to satisfy the investors through that financial return. And
Mm-hmm.
in some industries in the early days, the cost associated with being a socially responsible organization tends to be a little bit prohibitive against that bottom line result in some instances. Now, as it matures, and solar panels are an excellent example, or wind turbines, as that industry matures and the costs come down, then the excuses are stripped away. And I imagine, and I'm sort of breaking my question in half here, but there's two elements for me. One is that pressure that the operational group feel to perform and achieve the requirements of the board and the investors,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore to spend effort and energy fulfilling the need to be more socially responsible and have the right governance becomes a big challenge. And on the other side, the ability to adapt and be flexible enough to accommodate these often new technologies, new areas, is also a considerable challenge, and very much so for large organizations. So
Yeah.
I'm on board with the whole movement and the direction, but I also see the challenge that businesses face in moving that way.
Yeah. And look, I think that it feels like more of a challenge if you're still sitting in that unquestioning acceptance around there's these
Mm.
two options and it's all or nothing. Is it all in on
Yeah,
where just um, giving this purest idea of contributing and not only taking away the negative impacts, but we're massively contributing to environmental improvements, etc.,
yeah.
or we're just doing that short-term profit maximization. If we stay in the unquestioning of like, we have to go to one of those extremes,
Mm.
it is, as you said, very prohibitive to engage in some of these conversations early on.
Yeah.
The reason why it's important to therefore start with breaking down that mindset and those approaches about the beliefs of business and about what contribution actually means, we have to start with that because if we do that first, then we can have really real conversations with
Mm.
either investors or customers
Yeah.
or team members that say, look, we're not trying to go from 0 to 100 in one hit, but we have thought about this and we can explain how over X amount of years,
Yeah.
here are the steps we're going to take. We want to get to a place where we're operating like this, but without breaking the whole business in the process, that
Mm.
has to have horizons, if you like. We have to come at this in a staged approach.
Yeah.
And people respect that if you're honest. If we go back to some of the pushback around something like ESG, where people get tripped up is by thinking they have to present this completely unrealistic sense of perfection straight away,
Mm.
but then they're not delivering that. If I'm buying your product, so say, for example, there's a company here in Australia called T2. All I drink is their tea. I love it. And I had conversations many years ago now when they brought on, so they're a B Corp. A B Corporation is a type of status that you can take where there's some external accounting for and looking at, are you actually doing the things you're saying around environmental, social governance issues? And I had a conversation with them around, okay, but there's a lot of plastic in your packaging, talk me through some of these bits. And they were really honest and they said, look, we know that. We have the challenge of, in order to keep the tea
Mm.
fresh and sealed, we don't have an alternative at this point, but here's what we're doing. And over this, so they explained the logic. Now, multiple years later, all of the plastic inside is biodegradable. They had to get to that place, right? But they were honest with me. They didn't pretend and then me feel tricked as the person engaging, right?
Yeah.
So I think part of it is just about that, being honest of, here's what we're doing and I can answer your question. We have thought about it, but I'm not promising the world and then disappointing you.
Mm.
It's also then this element, one of the main tools that we train people in is using the business model canvas. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if you're familiar with it, the
I,
one page. Now, it's a tool that is deceptively simple, and most people only use it in a simplistic way. When you master business modeling, one of the best places to innovate on your business model is in what's called the backstage,
mhm.
which is when we look at key activities, key resources, and key partners. What's interesting is most people, when they feel that pull that you described of like, I would love to do this, but it's too expensive or too time consuming, I'll get to it one day, like when we're bigger, when we're more profitable. If you learn to business model well, in the back end of your business, the opportunities to innovate there move you out of just feeling like your only options are to raise prices or do a massive cost cutting exercise, right? And it allows you to start doing things like saying, okay, if we've identified that because we produce a certain product, if we're having a massive negative environmental impact here,
Mhm.
we don't have to straight away go to a really expensive solution, but we have to look at all of the elements we can play with. There's a great company here in Australia called Who Gives a Crap? Please excuse my language. It's a toilet paper, right? Great company. Have a look at them. They did this innovation really well by actually looking at their broader system and realizing that keeping their manufacturing in Australia was actually increasing their environmental damage because they couldn't get access to enough already used recyclable materials,
Right.
and they were using trucks for freighting
Mm.
things around. And when they found what would for many people seem like an option that would have worse environmental impacts, when they found particular angles where they could produce in China, they actually found a ample supply of recyclable materials, and now we're able to ship direct from China to their international markets. And shipping was much more effective in terms of it reduced their environmental damage
Yeah.
than using trucks. And they could now have ships taking it to Europe, to the US, to Australia. In the process of improving their environmental impact, they reduced their costs in the
Mm.
back end. And it wasn't a matter of, oh, we have to make sure we're taking all plastic out of our packaging regardless. They could take all of that out and drop their costs because they worked the business model until they found the win-win. And I think in many instances, we're too simplistic of going, we need to reduce plastic, so that means we need to go for a more expensive option, rather than thinking like zoom out a bit and figure we're not finished playing with designing the business model until it stacks up on all of those sides.
Mm. It's the business canvas itself is such a simplistic, as you said, it's often misinterpreted, I think,
Yes.
when
So it's
we
always
look
say
at,
it's simple, not simplistic, but it's deceptively simple because you kind of can look at it and go, how could that be useful? But when done well, it's very powerful.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
We try and look at things from a systemic or a systems perspective,
exactly.
and look at that big ecosystem,
Mm,
and sort of work our way in rather than start inside and try and,
I agree.
yeah, so
Yeah.
it tends to be very interesting. Ha- I'm also always cautious of the time, and the conversation has been so intriguing. How do you measure success? If you're now putting your cap on as an impact investor, what's the criteria for you making an investment into a company from a measurable, successful outcome?
Yeah. So again, because I see it as a lens, not an asset class, each investment is different. So if I'm investing in a really speculative piece, I'm only investing money I'm willing to lose, right? Because I know it's speculative.
Right.
That's very different to if I'm saying I'm going to put a debt piece into this. So I have some direct investments with companies that are debt, so lower risk. My expectation of return is lower, therefore, and I'm looking at that in different ways. So I think I have to clarify that piece first, that each
Sure.
investment, it depends on the type of investment.
Absolutely.
If I go to, oh, sorry.
Please.
Yeah. If I go to kind of a higher order answer to that question of like, what does success look like? What I'm looking for in every investment is that we've incentivized the right behavior. And what I mean by that is from a business model perspective, can that business explain to me how, in increasing their revenue, their profitability, the money that they're going to be able to therefore pay back to me as an investor, is the way that they're doing that, is their understanding of their own business connected to that it will only grow and make more money if it's actually doing the elements on the business side that are improving that social or environmental aspect of what I'm looking for.
Mhm.
And I want to clarify that I'm not just talking about, oh, it's creating no plastics in the ocean or it's ending poverty. I'm not talking about dramatic
Right.
things. It can be down at that level of that the social element of what they're doing is that they're paying their staff well, is that they're ensuring there's safe conditions and that the well-being of their staff are taken care of. That's a really important social element. We sometimes romanticize and think that it's only having a positive impact in the world if it's huge and it's at the level
Mm.
of poverty alleviation. All of us know the impact that is had if we're working in a organization that is toxic and stressful, and we go home angry and agitated and have that kind of infect all of our families and relationships. So depending what that business's focus is, whether it's something internal like team and culture, or whether it is about making their products accessible to a certain group in society, it can look very different. But whatever it is that they're trying to do in the world and hang their hat on, I want to understand that the business model is built in a way that it's only growing and making more money if it's delivering on that. I don't want to see a mismatch where we're incentivizing them to please make as much money as you can. And maybe if there's a little bit left over, you can do more good. I want the business model to show me they're connected to each other.
It needs to be woven through the strategy of the business, not just um, a line item in their P&L or their balance sheet. It needs to be a complete approach.
Yeah, there's got to be a logic to that. So, say, for example, there was a company that I was involved in where it was providing loans to people that the mainstream financial institutions wouldn't give loans to. And the way the business model was built, unless people had a good experience from taking that loan and then gave good reviews, told the nonprofits that worked with them that they should keep recommending this company, and word of mouth was coming back to them continuing to be trusted as a provider of those loans, the business wouldn't grow. Like if they weren't doing their job well and providing that, we would see either stagnation or it would decrease. And so we had enough indicators there that the business model was set up so that it was creating a win-win, that I went, great, okay, you're incentivized. If you want to grow and make money, you have to be delivering a quality product to these otherwise disenfranchised people. Right? It wasn't saying to them, if you make money, you're bad, because I want them to make money. As you said before, this isn't a grant, it's an investment. Right? I want to make money on it, but I want to make sure that it's not at the cost. I always say to people, if the only way your business can make money is by taking advantage of someone else, or by, someone else losing, then I don't think you've worked your business model enough. Like I don't want to invest in a company that is lazy in the will win by someone else losing. I'm not interested.
How do you get that level of detail? Let's say I'm a small investor. I want to, go down this path. Where can I find this level of detail? Do I find it in their annual reports? I would doubt it has enough information.
So it depends. Some of these investments, if you are like a lot of the investments where I've made direct investments, I'm having conversations with those that are running the business. So that's a very distinct piece. If you're at the level of like what's called a retail investor and you're just one of many, or you're
Yeah.
investing on the stock market, you only have what's publicly available. And so that element is going to take a different level of research or due diligence of choosing these companies. Part of it is sort of sitting back and looking at some of those pieces we talked about before, of trying to check, am I feeling a dissonance between what they're saying and then how they behave? Am I seeing a difference of like there's this token kind of nod to environmental aspects, but when I look at, I've ordered their product and when it comes, I'm a bit off put by the amount of plastic, or by, think through, where do I see a disconnect?
Mm.
So don't just take what they say on their website and then believe that. As you said, when we look at something like a publicly available report, people can say whatever they want in those things. So you're going to have to do a little bit of digging, or talk to people who are invested, look for interviews with the owner, find those elements where you go, I'm really loving that it seems like there's consistency here between what they're saying and what they're doing. Right? So you can still look for that through things like, even look up past employees and what they say about the organization. You're always going to have to be discerning in it, because sometimes someone might say something horrible just because they felt ripped off because they got fired, and actually the company did nothing wrong. Nothing is going to be perfect, even when you do the conversations yourself as a direct investor. I've made plenty of investments directly where I absolutely backed those people and they screwed me over, right? You get it wrong sometimes, but you can't allow that to make you do nothing. I think it's that piece that I spoke about in those early days of ethical investment. Intention still matters. So your desire to go, I'm looking to actively invest in, and pick what you care about. If you're thinking about a particular issue in the world that is important to you, you can start, you don't even have to go straight to the investment. You can just start with the dollars of where you're spending money and look for companies. If you really care about youth or education, then look for companies where you go, I really like the way that they behave or support this bit, or how. So look for aspects that you respect, start small, and just start asking questions, right? You're always looking for, okay, is action matching rhetoric?
Yeah. Bessie, it's a hugely fascinating topic, and as always, we never have enough time.
No.
I started our conversation with a couple of abbreviations,
Yeah.
SRI, CSR.
CSI. Yeah.
Yeah. we better confirm what those
Sure.
abbreviations are. So, SRI.
So there's, are you, I mean, different, some of these overlap too into multiple
Right.
areas. So there can be social return on investment.
Okay.
Um, there can be, sorry,
I was going to say socially responsible investment.
yep. So
Yeah,
there's, um, and so again, when I said before that sometimes people talk about ethical investment, responsible investment,
yeah,
social responsible investment, like
yeah.
people use different language.
Right.
And part of what I would encourage people to do is not get too hung up on the label. I'm
Yes.
less interested in that. I'm interested in the practice. So that's sort of one of those elements. The CSI aspect of CSR, corporate social responsibility.
Yeah.
Look at us with all our acronyms. You end up getting confused yourself. Was a bigger deal previously. I would say in most companies, it's kind of becoming a bit of an outdated element.
Right.
But when and also it's not really in that small and medium size. It's more listed companies, big companies that have a corporate social responsibility team. And in many respects, it often falls into more of a philanthropy, giving back to the community to have, here's another acronym and things people talk about, like social license to operate. So often people talk about that. CSR often fits in that category. It's a big company going, how do we sponsor a football team locally and give money to this bid or volunteer here? So
Mm.
it's less going back into the elements we've spent this conversation talking about, of that company saying, how are we making decisions? How are we treating our staff? What do our suppliers think about how we pay them or their conditions, right? And it's more surface level. So lots of those acronyms at the beginning are things you will hear as you try to tune into this space. I would love for you to kind of hold those lightly and come back to those elements of, for yourself as a leader, for your company, where do we already have decision-making rights? Where are we already spending money? And how could we start to be more thoughtful in aligning those things so that we're contributing to pieces that we're proud of and that we actually care about?
Fantastic spot to finish that conversation. Where can people go if they want to learn more about what you're doing and connect with you?
So if they want to connect and actually have a bit of back and forward, LinkedIn would be my favorite platform for that. And then if people are wanting to head to a website or dig around a little bit more, and we can share links, either benefit.capital, so that's our Benefit Capital site, or bessigraham.com. So they would be, from a website perspective, the places to go.
We will put the links in the show notes, so everyone please search for them. Bessi, great conversation. Wish we had another couple of hours. We could have gone much further and much deeper, but thank you for that, and really encourage everybody to give this topics a lot more thought than what I suspect many of you do at the moment. So thank you, and look forward to staying in contact.
Thanks, Wayne. Really appreciate it. And I am happy to, any questions people have, please do reach out. Happy to continue the conversation.
So what are you waiting for? Hit the subscribe button below and click on the bell icon so I can pop up in your feed occasionally with a great tip for your ultimate growth.